this is the one I've actually personally been looking forward to the most. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically have each of these individuals who is absolute subject matters in their specific area of focus within this topic introduce themselves and talk a little bit about, first of all, where they're based and what their specialization is in post-processing. So if we can get those back doors shut, and again, everybody just quiet down. We're gonna dive into this, and this is gonna get deep quick. Thanks, everybody. Rackams, why don't you kick it off?
All right. So my name is Rackams, Nick Rackams. I'm from Northern California, Sacramento, Grass Valley, Gold Country area. My expertise or specialty, I guess you could say, is mechanical separation of THCA and terpenes from an input of properly cured rosin. And been doing that now for about the past 4 or 5 years. Saw a couple people do it before me and took their work and kind of broke it down in my mind and figured out how to do the process myself. Since then, been sharing it with everybody like yourselves. And yeah, we'll be talking more about that a little later.
Larry, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name's Larry. Currently live in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm from Rhode Island. I lived in Colorado for 5 years, kicked around a lot of labs there. I wouldn't necessarily say I have a specialty because I am the director of a lab that makes a lot of live resin BHO and also live rosin. If I did say I had a specialty, it would be, proper allocation of frozen material for extraction.
A little closer to your mouth, Larry.
Sorry. If I did have a specialty, I would say is the proper allocation of frozen material for extraction, and figuring out what your best routes are to do with your frozen, and why you're going to do that. Yeah.
Mikey, you want to kick it off?
Hey, yeah, should I do the thing?
Introduce yourself, where you're from, what your specialties are.
Okay, so I'm Mikey, also known as MTS. I just like to say I'm from the tri-state. I'm from the worst laws in the tri-state, so you can figure out which state that is. My specialty, I won't call it my specialty. I'll just say I've done a lot of jar tech. I didn't really need to profit from my stuff, so I got to experiment a lot, and I like to share those experiments. Lately, I've also been doing some prep work for filling carts, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today as well.
Caitlin?
Hi there, my name is Caitlin. I have a rosin brand from Canada. We are from BC, currently in the Kootenays. One of my specialties, I suppose, is also mechanical separation, although I've played with a lot of different post-processing and jar tech strategies. I'm one of the few people putting solventless diamonds out on the market in Canada, so I'm excited to talk about that a little bit later on.
Awesome. Lindsay?
Hey, I'm Lindsay. We've been doing a lot of interesting work on carts lately for solventless carts. I think we have a pretty unique lab method, so I'd say that's our specialty.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to dive into this, and I've kind of broken this down into 4 different segments. So the first thing we're going to talk about is jar tech. So, Mikey, I want to kick it off with you and talk a little bit about, or first ask you what led you to explore this segment of the industry so heavily.
So when I started making rosin, I was doing this by myself. I was experimenting by myself. I'm in an area where I wasn't around a whole bunch of other hash makers. I wasn't able to experience what they were experiencing. So when I first cured my first jar and it just looked like lumpy mashed potatoes, I didn't realize that I needed to work my wrist out and turn this into this butter. I was just like, why doesn't this look like this wet, amazing stuff that I see other people producing, even though I did it in living soil and I followed all these things that I thought would make me wet rosin. So, I learned about heat tech, and that was just something that I started experimenting with. In some cultivars, it can be an improvement. I think sometimes we get too narrow-minded as to, it has to be this, I only do this, I only make melt, I only do fresh press. I think that as long as it's something that washes and makes sense for you, especially if you like the terps, figure out what works best for that and kind of run with that. Maybe if it doesn't fit your ethos, you hand it off to a buddy who does enjoy that SKU.
What have you found to be the commercial viability of jarring or jar tech or applying heat post-process? Do you feel as though you need to be able to identify which varietals are able to produce better outcomes, and do you have to apply that heat to find that out, or can you identify certain characteristics before you have to introduce heat to the product that would indicate one way or another whether or not that would jar cure or heat tech well? Is it an observation that you can make from the resin coming off the press?
You learn way more about it during the curing process. I would say coming straight off the press is not a great indication of what you can tell, but however, something that cures out light but then turns dark within a week at room temperature, that to me shows that there's a lot of degrading compounds in there, and I don't want that for jar tech. Also, if something changes its nose dramatically within the first part of the curing process, like say it starts off really gassy, but then like a week or two later, you lose all that gas and there's just like really subtle hits of fruit. Often if you jar tech, you're gonna end up with those just subtle hints of fruit. So you want terps that are really strong, have a lot of staying power. You also want terps that will recrystallize well. So one place where you're going to have really strong terps, but they really suck for this process, in my opinion, is like Tangy, some of your Trops, stuff like that, which I've ranted about plenty of times.
What are some of the most common mistakes when you're working with individuals or consulting for groups that you're seeing in the processes for jar tech?
Jar teching large batches before doing the R&D to see if that's something that you really want to do just because it came out dry. I do agree that you should be trying to change it for your end user, because unfortunately we're stuck in this kind of bias that everyone wants a wet jar when they open it. And unfortunately, if you're just sending out a whole bunch of dry stuff, regardless of how fire it is, your uneducated end user, which is going to be probably more than your is not going to like that. So it's going to have a negative outcome on your business. And then aside from that, I would say putting in bad material. Anything that has kind of that like burnt aftertaste, or that you have to hit low on the nail. Say you usually dab at 570 and there's like this really fire strain that you have, but it's like, bro, you got to hit that 530. Only way it tastes good. That's not going to be good for jar tech, because whatever's going on, that heat that's making it have that kind of burnt or nasty back end on the taste, it's also going to be bad. So, you can't just smell a jar, think that you like it, and be like, all right, it didn't change after 2 weeks, we're still going to jar tech this. Take a dab of it, see what's going on there, see if that flavor travels through the dab and leaves it on your palate. It's a good indicator as well.
What are you watching for bubble-wise? When you're going through the curing, when you're going through the tech in your oven, what can you tell the folks here as far as when you feel or when your observation tells you you're ready to pull that jar?
Can we do the dab thing?
Let's do it.
Okay, so this is dependent on pressure. So let's get a bunch of wooks to do some physics. Yeah. So this works much better with a traditional banger. If you have a slurper or something like that, you're relying upon the vacuum to draw the oil up. It may not work as well, but the principle is still the same. So anybody that feels like it, let's take your dab rig, get a dab on your tool, and start heating that up, and we'll talk about it a little bit, okay?
Just like a traditional dish is what Mikey's the optimal example for this yes. experiment would be.
So, and then start heating up your banger, right? And what we're gonna do for this experiment is you're going to go in maybe 10, 15 degrees hotter than you usually would. So that way you would think this would produce more vapor, but you're gonna take like half of a hit. And you're gonna take that half of a hit, and then you're gonna pull away from your rig, you're gonna breathe in, and you're gonna exhale, and you're gonna see how much smoke you got, how much vapor you got. Then you're going to put your carb cap on, and you're going to take a regular hit, and we can talk about the differences in between those. So while we're doing that, let's talk about the bubble level a little bit. To me, this is a bit dependent on your material. If something is super terpy, if you're running a lot of outdoor, right, where you're getting that bigger layer of terp fraction on top of your diamonds, I like to run my stuff a little bit less. If it's something that's like a very high THCA producing indoor that is not showing as much terps, I like to run that a little bit more. So what we're talking about with the bubbles is it's going to go through multiple stages. It's going to go from, you're probably running it from fresh press. You can do this from cured. So it's going to start to melt down, and then you're going to see bubbles form close to the glass. Eventually, those bubbles will start sliding up the glass. Eventually, that will come to a mostly liquidized solution, and those bubbles will start getting smaller and moving faster. So, and at one point, the very bottom of the dish, when you look up across it, will look like a high-grade distillate, right? Above that will be a little bit cloudy, and then the bubbles will actually be forming a little bit higher than the bottom of that, right? So I like to go anywhere between 10 and 35%. 35% is really pressing it. So like if I have one of those high THCA indoors, my Pops Juice is a very good example of that. For anyone that's gotten to try that, I was going for diamonds, and you've seen it's just a sugar, and that's because I didn't take it quite far enough. I only took it to like 25%, and it really needs to be taken right to the edge of not coming back if you want diamonds, versus something that I have that's more terpy. I can take that to like 25%, still have that. I like to pull it out. I like to see it clear up completely within 5 to 10 minutes within the oven. If I see it start to get cloudy or nucleate within the first hour, often I haven't taken it quite far enough for diamonds. I've just taken it far enough for like a good sugar, maybe a little bit bigger chunk sugar. So that's where I like to pull it. Are any of us doing dabs? There, I see one guy, right? So yeah, we got some people. So what's going on, right, is you're hitting that even hotter, but you're hitting that, right, basically at atmospheric pressure. So the boiling point is, I want to say that we figured this out, and it's somewhere around like 820 degrees or something. You need to hit a dab if you're not hitting it with a carb cap, right? And then when you apply that carb cap, what you're doing is you're changing the amount of pressure within that. You're lowering it from atmospheric pressure, which is changing the boiling points, right? The same thing is happening within your freeze dryer, right? That's how we're preserving the terps and sublimating the water out. Same thing is happening also with JarTech, right? So we're heating these up. So we don't want to boil the terpenes off, right? So we're increasing the pressure within the jar. That's why it's really important you have a lid that holds excellent pressure. So I like the U-lines a little bit better than the ball jars, because they're designed to be vacuumed. They're not designed for pressure. The U-lines will hold a little bit more. I believe ball jars are designed to start leaking at an excess of 6 pounds. And from my understanding, we're looking for closer to 10 pounds for optimal diamond formation. But the thing is that we're lowering the boiling points of those terpenes, so that way it may even be like, I think, whatever. I'm not going to go into specific numbers because I'm not remembering them right now, and I've been doing a lot of dabs. But regardless, you're lowering them much, much lower, so that way you're not off-gassing all of these terps while you're doing the JarTech. It's very important.
Fire. Give it up for MTS Farms, yo. That was a lot of fucking tech. All right, I want to turn over to Lindsay and talk a little bit about rosin carts. I know you've been doing some really interesting work in the lab, and everybody, this is going to be for everybody as we lead into mechanical separation. But first, we're going to touch on carts. So Lindsay, why don't you expand a little bit on the work you've been doing?
Yeah, so we've got a unique way of doing carts. It's probably about a $6,000 setup or so, but you could take out some of the tech from this and do it cheaper in say a vacuum oven or something. But what we're doing is we have, and I forget all the glassware names, so forgive me. We have a round bottom vessel with a magnetic pill for agitating. We do a low temperature. This process takes about 24 hours. We do a low temperature heat on it to make it cart stable. And we also, it's all under vacuum, and we have a cold trap. So any terpenes that are leaving in this process get caught in a cold trap and dropped down. We heat it for 2 12-hour days. Under vacuum, it's spinning the whole time, very low, about 180, because that vacuum assists with the decarboxylation, I guess. And after, we aim for a 13% weight loss. That's when we know it's done, and it's going to be cart stable. So just take it to the scale every once in a while. Look at what your weight loss is to get to the decarboxylation you need to keep it cart stable. 13% loss is the key number there. a 13% weight loss, yeah. And from there, we just, when the process is done, we just run the terpenes we captured, put it in the freezer, freeze any water, run it through a coffee filter, reintroduce it to the solution you made, and we're done within 24 hours. Sorry, I forget the name of the equipment we're using, but it's from Summit Research.
Very cool. Mikey, what experiences have you had as far as filling carts and the research you've done?
So I haven't done a ton of stuff with like cold trapping terps or anything like that. I've talked to a lot of BHO people and some people on the future forums that are into those things. I like to be able to just keep everything within one jar. I think that there is value in separating and bringing back together. I don't always know that I agree with what that does to taste profiles and solvent lists. So I've just been focusing on single jar type stuff, and one of the bottlenecks that I see for a lot of, especially smaller producers, but everyone in general, I just worked with a company out in LA that was using a cart filler, is the bubbles, right? So I'm guessing that you're doing that with an open top, so you're not having...
No, everything's under vacuum, so I'm not oxidizing any terps or anything. Like, we're trying to maintain that same terp profile. So I don't even turn the heat on until my vacuum is drawn.
The jar itself is under vacuum?
No, I'm putting all my rosin into a big round bottom flask to go that sits in a heat mantle with the bottom agitation.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like I said, this isn't really your home setup. This is a pretty industrial setup.
Yeah, so... All right, so if I can understand what he's doing, he won't run into this problem. But again, if you're keeping the solution as one solution and you're heating, keeping it under pressure, not vacuum, you're going to create bubbles in there, right? And we just talked about why you would keep things under pressure in order to maintain those boiling points of the terpenes, so you're not off-gassing them while you're heating them. Same thing with cartridges. So after you go through that process of getting it ready for carts, you're left with something that should never renucleate. But the problem is that you're going to have bubbles in there. So if you draw that up into a syringe, if you just pour that out into one of the big machines that's going to inject it into carts, what you're going to find is as you're injecting it into those carts, you're going to see bubbles forming. You're not going to be able to get a full fill, because if you put that half gram or whatever you're trying to put into the cart, because of those bubbles, they're going to come up and out of there. So there's multiple paths to solutions. Some of them are very advanced and require very expensive equipment. That's cool. If you're working in a lab that already has all of those sorts of things, I recommend you try those. I definitely recommend you keep an eye on what that does to your flavor profiles, as it can affect them. And same way that long-term heat can affect things. So you have to be careful with all of these processes. So let's talk about some easy ways to get rid of those bubbles. One, you can just leave if you did in a ball jar, you could just leave that lid back on top, set it back in the oven, heat it for a while. That pressure is gonna cut off gas. That's not a very aggressive strategy. If you're doing them by hand and you haven't created a ton of pressure that needs to off gas within that solution, that's fine. Past that, everybody here has a dab tool. You probably have a drill at your home. You can literally heat up that solution to whatever you feel is viscous enough for you. Right? I usually go at least 120 degrees, and then you literally just dab tool. You don't need to have it on a drill. You can whip it by hand. I whip it until I see the bubbles stop forming. Then I put the lid back on and let that just come back to even. I don't worry about if the bubbles are still in there. I'm just trying to get them to all pop within the jar. Lid can go right back on, so you're trying to maintain the terps. Past that, there's centrifuge, right? So with centrifuge, you have to be careful. If you're using one of the big expensive ones, you can separate that into layers. If you're trying to remove fats and waxes and maybe work on your viscosity, like the solution that you made is way too viscous to work in your carts, and you're going to separate that into layers of density, you can take your terpene fraction and then not use all of your THCA or your more dense fraction below that and mix them together. You are going to be experiencing loss, but if that's a giant outdoor farm and you have a bunch of material and you're really looking for those carts to flow well, that's an option. For our home guys that are trying to do this cheap, right? You can make your own centrifuge. Just look this up online. You can make really nice ones for a couple $100, and you can spin that out and remove the bubbles that way. That's a really cool tech. Some people don't want to add extra stuff into your place, and you have a tool that will work just fine. And then past that, I've heard many different people kind of speculating on this, and I have a couple people that I'm talking to that work on this, using ultrasonic type stuff, different types of waves on this, right, to be able to get the bubbles out. And I haven't had it explained well enough to me that I completely get it, right? So there's the guy right there working on it. He does some of that stuff. I'm sure if you hit him up, right? My homie right there, Hawaii. Chad Mad Chiller. So he can talk to you about some of the experiments he's doing. And he's doing that to change kind of the viscosity of his cold cure, right? And the look of his cold cure.
I don't know if I'm doing it right. That's why I asked the question. But I've been fucking around, just looking at different ways, trying to keep things solventless, but like maybe speed things up or what I'm looking for in the process. If this experiment will do that for look or whatever I'm looking for. So I used to use a sonicator for CBD isolate to mix it into my oils and make sure that there was no separation. And I started doing MCT oil soaks for our solventless RSO, just to kind of get a cleaner med and away from ethanol extraction for my friends and family. And I brought the sonicator in to do that and was just sitting there in the lab super baked one day, and I was like, fuck this, how can I use this sound wave technology to hit this rosin, not fuck it up, but what will it do? And I just started fucking around with it, taking cold cure and throwing it in 2 minutes, 5 minutes, different water temps. Basically doing the science, looking up viscosity and different shit like that. I'm the farthest person from chemistry or anything, but just taking a heat gun and watching it, taking it off the plate. First I did cold cure and then was reheating the rosin, and I'm like, fuck, why am I reintroducing heat? So I took it, jarred it fresh off the plates, heat gunned it, making sure it never dropped below 120, then threw it in the solution and sonicate it. And I've noticed in doing that, it not only homogenizes it fresh inside the jar, lidded, but stability is unbelievable that it does for certain chicks. But I've seen the bubble effect, I've seen a lot of different things with it. I don't know the science behind it. I could be fucking the shit up, but I've been doing some cool shit and asking questions at different seminars and things and asking people if they've seen it. And some people put sonicators in their vessels, and there's a 6-inch circumference why the machines are designed the way they are. I don't know any of that tech, but I've seen some really cool things with consistency, stability. My turtle traffic, I put that thing in there. She stays stable, fresh pressed, that look all the way through. And I think part of that is the homogenization, molecule structure, breakdown. I don't fucking know. I could be fucking it up. But that's what I've seen in introducing an old piece of tech into the solvent world and hoping that that concept is considered still solventless for not having to whip, not having to beat up the heads later on. And again, that's just been my research. I could be going in the wrong direction, but something I dove into.
So you're gonna hear a decent amount of people saying stuff like that. They all have a very different, I wouldn't say a very different perspective, but a different view on what they're going for. But they're trying experiments with stuff like this. And I really recommend that you try that yourself if you're in a non-restrictive environment. I was able to do all the experiments I wanted and fuck up all my stuff that I wanted. I could ruin any batch, it didn't really matter. So if you're in a non-restricted environment and you can do lots of R&D and you have some ideas, flush them out, look stuff up, see if it works.
Give it up for that conversation. Give it up for MTS Farms. All right, so I want to move into mechanical separation. I think we'll start at the beginning and then we'll move into the deep end. So Rackham's, we're going to start with you, then we're going to move to Caitlin, then we're going to open it up to everybody. But why don't you take us through, what made you first explore mechanical separation? Did you accidentally isolate THCA? Like what?
Yeah, I fucked up. That's what happened. Yeah, my first experience with mechanical separation, or THCA, and isolating it specifically was literally a fuck up. I was doing, not even a fuck up, I was just doing a second press on a bag, put it back in the press at the same temperature I originally did the first press at, took it off. I think I went longer with the second press, so instead of like just a quick minute hammer down, I did like 5 or 6 minutes because I walked away from the press. Came back, pulled it out, and there was this white film on the outside of the bag. And I don't know if any of you guys who have pressed have seen that before, but that's THCA. At that time, I didn't know it. So shout out to a gentleman named Casey, who is not here, but he was probably one of the first guys that got me to understand the process of what was actually happening. Not a scientist, not a chemist, so I don't have that background, but he does. And he broke it down to it being that cannabinoid being crystallized and turned into a solid from a liquid based off the temperature that it was exposed to for a certain amount of time. So from there, I took it upon myself. He gave me a few different steps to play around with and just to see what would happen. And I took some rosin, I let it cure up and nucleate, pretty much just like a 10-gram slab. Wrapped that in a 25 or 15 micron bag, I think at 25 that I had at the time. And then dropped my temperature down to about, my press temperature down to about, I think 90 degrees or so, and put that 10 grams in the press for, it ended up being about 7 or 8 hours it was in there, because I didn't know what the fuck I was doing at the time. And sure enough, what happened is the terpenes fraction, which is pretty much everything else but the THCA, started to liquefy. That's any of those cannabinoids or compounds that would not turn into a solid. Liquefy and separate, and then what you're left over with is a pure THCA, or close to as pure as possible, structure left in the pouch. And it literally looks, if you do it properly, it looks like white sheetrock. Or we can name a few other drugs, but we're not here to talk about those. But from there, you have two fractions, and that's the whole purpose of this mechanical separation, is to take a single rosin and separate it once again, do a post-process, a final process to separate your terpenes and all those cannabinoids from your THCA. And then you can take that THCA, that white powdered crystal structure, and melt that down back into a liquid with a higher heat. Now that you've separated the terpenes and you have those and they're viable, the THCA should not smell or taste like anything. THCA has a distinct taste to itself. If anybody's ever dabbed really high percentage THC, like BHO, sugar or something, you get like a film on your lips or on your teeth, that's THCA. You can melt that down, liquefy it, and then it clears up. And then once that turns back into a solid or a crystalline structure, then you can break it up, and that's what we call the diamonds. Now you have your two fractions, and you can now dose the way that you want to dose. You can do mixed ratios. You can mix other terpenes from other separations with different diamonds. There's kind of sky's the limit at that point. But my whole purpose for doing this was just to make one more option for an end user to have as a SKU, or just a different consistency. It was fun, it was interesting. I made a mistake, I learned from it, and was able to expand from it, and now we're here breaking it down. It's pretty amazing.
What are your observations on what mechanically separates well, or how do you as a maker assess material that's coming into your lab and going, this is going to go to mechanical separation versus this is something that I'm going to fresh press or cold cure?
That can happen on the press. If something that you have, a strain that you have tends to auto butter no matter what temperature you're pressing it at. And what I mean by auto butter is it literally sugars or cures up off the press immediately. It doesn't stay as fresh pressed. It's not as stable. That's usually a really quick indicator that strain or those genetics specifically have a high percentage of THCA. So those are going to be the ones that you more than likely can isolate and extract better than other ones that'll be really sappy, or even a lot more of a heavier terpene content and less THCA. Like Mikey mentioned, there's a lot of tangies and citruses that are more prone to the sappier side of things. But if you don't know that percentage of that THCA content with those genetics moving through or forward with like data or lab work, then the visual aspect is usually initially right off the press with the auto butter. But after you take your press or you take your rosin and you slab it out however you need to, you can actually let that sit for 12 to 24 hours with parchment on top of it in your facility kept in a clean space, and see what happens. If it nucleates pretty quick and starts to cure up within that time frame, then it's probably a good candidate. But if it's still stable, still really clear, isn't really marbling or curing up the way you expected it to, it might not be the best bet for the process.
Caitlin, I want to move to you and ask you a little bit about, what was your learning curve like as you scaled up and learned your process around MexEp?
So the learning curve for that was definitely a very steep learning curve. I decided to take on diamonds just as another way to differentiate myself in the market, and again, like you said, to provide another SKU for the end user, another way to enjoy the experience. And I found the first few times that I made it, like the loss in the process was exponential, and it almost made it not worth trying to do. But I was in a lucky position where I was able to play with material and lose material, and I had some excess material, so I was able to just redo the process and do the process and do the process. And I started from like an unreasonable amount of loss down to under 10% loss in my process, and which actually made it like a viable product that I could use and put forward to people. Because when you have a 30% loss, it's not reasonable to carry on and to do at scale. But when you can break it down to less than 10, it's a much more usable product, and it's a much more commercializable product at that point.
You have a really cool way of doing your THCA. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thank you. So what I like to do is follow the same similar process, and then I take those rods and stretch them out the way you've seen in the past, like the way you've seen in your videos. And then once they're broken, I actually reintroduce a small amount of heat so that they are not such sharp edges. To me, I think taking those edges off are what make my diamonds the way they are representative of my diamonds, but to show them a little bit more rounded and a little bit softer, I think is a nice way to present them for the end user. So that's been my strategy so far, is just soften the edges. Little details.
It's a really cool look. I remember when I first saw it, and I was like, man, I've never seen those before. So that's really cool.
Thank you.
I also like to mention too that this process can be done with pretty much any type of rosin that you make. If it can be made from keef dry sift rosin, it can be made from flower rosin, hash rosin, like any of these rosins that you make, the rosin has to be able to cure a certain way right off the bat for you to know or not if you're going to be able to do this separation. Pretty much anything that does cure up or nucleate will separate. Just that's the easiest way to say and explain it. So if you have a question like you're not sure if your flower rosin will work, it will. You just have to do it.
I have done some really terpy rosins just to see what would happen because I had some extra kicking around, and I found you get like a much higher fraction of terp sauce than you do to diamonds. So you can still pull those diamonds out from that really terpy rosin that you do have, but you're going to have a lot more terp sauce to diamonds than you would from one that's been nucleated and that's buttered out like we're used to.
The process is a little bit more complicated to it, I feel like, and when you're messing with something that's a higher terpene content, then what I mean by that is not as stable, maybe a little bit more gooier. The other reason I like to make sure that the rosin dries up and cures up and nucleates is because I can handle it a lot easier than you can with something that's like that melts really easy, I guess you could say. It's harder to put words onto it, but it's more creamier of a consistency. That's going to be harder to work. That'll mean you have to have a lower temperature when you're starting the process, so this liquids can turn into a solid, meaning the THCA, and the actual terpene fraction can separate properly. If you go too fast, too much pressure, too much heat too quickly, you can push that THCA through the pouch or through the micron screen before you allow it to actually solidify. So that's things to take into consideration as well.
Absolutely. Anything you want to jump in on, Lindsay, before we move on?
No, one thing, talk about Casey there. I remember Casey was doing 120 gram presses, and I don't see that anymore. I'd love to see somebody come out with some big presses.
Yeah, Elysian Research, right?
Yeah,
the
Elysian
first
was doing
drip tech
killer
press
stuff.
ever made.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right, so I want to shift gears a little bit and head over to Larry. I'm super excited for this. I think this might be one of Larry's first speaking engagements, and we're incredibly excited about it. And he's going to be talking about some stuff that he's been working on as far as terpene recapturing, both in wash water as well as in the freeze dryer. And I know that's something that Lindsay's been playing with as well, so I'm sure Lindsay will jump in after Larry. But Larry, why don't you touch a little bit on the work you've been doing and what you've been playing around with?
So I'll just talk about my lab a little bit. I'm running an Osprey on a chiller setup. I don't have a cold room or anything. I'm in a really small space. So I just have a one freeze dryer, one osprey setup. I also have a short path that I hope to start utilizing more full time for this type of process, but it's pretty hard to have it stop making distillate in order to kind of help out with the terpenes. But anyway, the first way I'm going to talk about is from our freeze dryer ice. And
Closer to your face.
from our the first way I'm going to talk about is capturing the terpenes from our non-solvent products is from our freeze dryer ice. And this is by far and away the most simple way to do it. In my opinion, you don't get the largest volumes doing it, but for a lot of you smaller batch producers and people on a more craft scale, there's a way to increase your volumes that I'll get into now. So in quick terms, to kind of describe what we're doing is you can either chip the ice or just let it melt into a vessel of some sort, and you're going to get what's called a separation flask. You can get, 1,000 milliliter ones for like $400 or $500 from a lot of lab producers out there. And what you're going to do is you're going to fill that flask with your freeze dryer water, and after a half hour to an hour or so, you'll see a good layer of oil form at the top of that solution. A separation flask, what you can do is you pour off of your water from the bottom of a solution rather than the top, so you can drain it from the bottom. You're going to pour off, probably 98% of that water, and you'll be able to clearly see it. You'll get to a point in the solution where I just call it confusion, where it's hydrosol, then the pure terpene, and there's water below it. Pour off the rest of the water, and you're going to. I like to put it in a tall, narrow flask and freeze it and pour off my terpene from that. Once you pour off your terpene from that, you can do a lot of different things with these terpenes, whether it's reintroduce them into your rosin products, which I don't really love to do because, as he mentioned before, it does change the flavor from what the strain was originally, because these terpenes were going to boil off in the process of freeze drying, right? They're generally not there, and that's why we're not used to having them there. They're very mono. I've seen tested, the lab that I have to use to test these in Missouri, it's very hard for them to give me an accurate test because they're so pure. They have to dilute it like 50,000 times. And even then, I'll come back with a 102% test or so sometimes. And they test for 26 terpenes, and it'll hit for all of these different terpenes. So it has a very, very wide range of things in there, and they go very, very far. So, I'm seeing in like a pen batch per se, like something that is a blander strain with 1 to 2% of those terpenes can become all of a sudden a very flavorful pen experience. That being the more simple way to pull them out. As far as the wash water, depending on how you're set up and how you can do things, after you're done washing, you can go filter out all of your material, keep your water around, and you can do the same type of process in like a machine like an Osprey. So there's going to be those terpenes floating around in the water as well, because they came from the water that you dried out of your hash. They're also there on the heads a little bit, but I speculated that's mostly just in the water that you pull out of your hash, because you get larger volumes out of your wash water. And you should have to do basically the same thing and then put it in a separation flask. So what I would recommend doing is, like, after you're done washing, taking all of your material out of the machine, filtering the water again through the smallest micron bag. You have something that you don't use for hash production, just something that's going to kind of stay dirty. And then put your water back in your machine and take out 90% of the water, and then that's what you have to go filter through your separation flask there. You'll get a much larger volume out of it, but it's going to cost you a lot of time with the cleaning of the water and things along those lines.
I have a question. The freeze dryer side of it. So, what about people who have a non-oilless? They actually have oil in the pump. Are you worried? What about if there was any type of point in time that you would get oil pulled from the pump into the vac and then drain that water? Is there a way to separate that from the terpenes, or is that even an issue?
If you pulled oil into your machine, I wouldn't recommend trying to separate at that point, because it's going to be very difficult for you to tell what's what. But I think if you're running if you have an oil pump and you're there right when your machine shuts off and you're on top of your thing, you shouldn't run into that issue. And if you're conscious about it, you should be able to take care of it. Another thing I like to point out is like I haven't really been able to tell a large difference between whether I chip the ice, whether I just let it melt over time, or I defrost it. What I'm noticing is like only the shelves really get hot and the ice isn't on the shelves, so it's just helping it melt a little bit faster. And another thing that I want to mention, if you're struggling with pulling volume out of the freeze dryer, what you can do is you can stack your runs in there. So if you're gonna put, let's say you have 3 or 4 runs that you want to put together, you can mix these terpenes. And rather than defrosting your freeze dryer in between every run, just keep loading it up with more material, and that'll create more ice, which will give you more terpenes to pull out of. It's going to be a mixed strain or whatever, but you will get it in larger volumes that way. And then you can start playing to diversify and make other SKUs and make different flavor profiles with that, all with a non-solvent way to do it.
Lindsay, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think principle is the same. We just do it a little bit different. Some guys on my team came up with this. We bought thin neck flasks, so it's got a big volume on the bottom and a very thin neck. The terpenes are gonna float to the top, so we just take our freeze dryer water, pour it in the top, and then just grab a syringe and pull off the terpenes from the top. Squirt that into. We have like 6 freeze dryers going at all times, so we're just squirting that into a beaker. We get about, after 12 freeze dryer cycles, we get about 100 mils, something like that. So yeah, just suck it off and then again put it in the freezer and for an hour, a few hours, and then pour it through a coffee filter to get rid of any residual water.
And then what are you doing with it? Are you experimenting with it? Are you selling it? Are you?
Yeah, no, we'll reintroduce it into the cure. Yeah.
And what are you finding? Are you finding that it's dramatically changing profiles where you're not recognizing a profile to be a profile, or?
No, we've sent it to the lab and compared to the terps in the product itself, and it actually seemed to be the same profile from what we found. Yeah.
Interesting. So you're making a more terpy wet product at that point by re-adding those terpenes?
I don't see a huge difference, but we're playing with it.
Interesting. Okay, well, we're gonna open it up to questions at this point. I've got a bunch of different stuff I want to circle back to, but give it up for these guys. That was unbelievable. I think that paid for the ticket right there. Take that home. So we can take this, we got time, and we can take this wherever you want to go. The goal of Melting of the Heads is to give you guys value to take home, to share, to use, to leverage. So, these guys are up here. Who's got the first question? Right here.
I will say if you want numbers, I'll give you my Venmo later. Just kidding.
What do you guys understand about the concept of thermal gravidynamics and how this? Oh, hold on. I don't know how many people actually are onto this yet, but the concept of thermal gravidynamics and how that's starting to kind of apply to rosin and hash is a metric of quality, while it's melting, so to speak. And it's kind of a newer thing I have been hearing on and reading on, but.
Anybody? You might be the first, bro. We'll talk to you next year.
You're gonna have to Wikipedia this.
Anyone else? You got JarTech, you got rosin pens, you got terpene recapturing, and you got MechSep. What's up over here?
I know you said your first time it took you 7 or 8 hours to do that first capturing. Could you give it when you started refining it more and kind of make your process more efficient? And what kind of tests and times you're kind of running in that sort for that separation?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely decreased in time since that point in time. Now I'm down to pressing anywhere between 80 to 100 grams in less than 2 to 4 hours for the whole entire process. The reason it sounds like a long time, but you got to realize the main bulk of that process is the isolation of the terpenes and separating them away as quick and smoothly as possible. So there's least degradation as possible on those said terpenes, so you can still retain the actual smell and aroma that the rosin produced and keep that as level as possible. There will be a point in time where you get residual terpenes that are still in there that you have to then increase the heat and pressure on. But at that point, that amount is so minimal that you would probably not mix that with your first section of terpenes. That would just be a loss. And as far as temps and times, temps usually starting around, I mean, I think we talked solvents remediation. We're around 120, 130 now. And shout out to solvents remediation. He's one of the guys in Rhode Island that's got him on the white market as well. It's starting around that point. Like I said, if you have something that's a little bit more wetter of rosin, not as stable when it's in its cured form, you might want to start at a slightly lower temperature so you can isolate that A right off the bat and as quick as possible. So somewhere between 90 to 110. And then there's a first stage, and I call that the sweat stage. And what I mean by that is when the pouch is in the actual press and you can actually visibly see the mesh, when that starts to look like it's sweating, that means your terpenes are starting to fraction off and liquefy. And that at that point, you can start ramping up your temperature and your pressure as well. The pressure is pretty much non-existent except to hold that pouch and that puck in place for your first section of time. And then from there, you start increasing temp, and it just really depends on the amount that you're working with, either 5 grams or 500 grams. It's gonna depend on you in that moment in time. And from there, you ramp up your temperature every 10 to 20 degrees. I usually go about 10 to 15 minutes. I used to go every 30 minutes between ramping up temperatures and pressure. But as I've gone through over the years, I've been able to realize that you can pretty much cut those times in half. But it also, once again, depends on the product that you're using at that given time. So I hope that helped answer your question a little bit.
Next question. Over here. Good
More than
question.
likely, that's a good question. So more than likely you're just trying to isolate the THCA and disregard the terpene fraction because it's probably not going to be your most favorable, depending on, unless you're after the specific terpenes that keef rosin has to offer. If you can take that keef and refine it through dry sieve screens to 99.9% heads, then press it into rosin, you might have a more favorable terpene profile. But this whole process also gives you the option to take something that isn't as viable as you hoped for, and like a food grade rosin, a 45 micron or a 160 or higher micron that you plan to do food grade with. If you try the THCA process, maybe you can then take this and strip the terpene. Check. And the color away at the same time and still have a viable product, your THCA. And you can liquefy it back down to a liquid and let it harden up to a solid. And then you'll have that crystalline like diamond structure. Or you can leave it as a raw THCA. It's still a consumable product at that point. But now you've given that not so desirable product that you originally had and turned it into something else. Not really trying to shine a turd, so to speak, but you can in this instance to keep something viable and continue on. So if you have rosin that's really green, it had a lot of chlorophyll pushed through it, but it butters up or cakes up, it might still be good to continue it down the line. Separate that color and that flavor as best as you can with this post-process, and then you can still have that final psychoactive compound.
Next question. I thought I saw one over here. Yeah. I'll come over the chat. So this is these guys are able to turn less than optimal, because what's winning cups is these ultra premium, perfectly grown varietals that are hunted and cared for, and some of those will work well in jams and cures and mexep, but you're not going to be working with all that material that often, and when you get a hold of it, you're going to know how special that is. So being able to have these optionalities to create these form factors is the difference between feast and famine in depressed markets. So, as much as we want to talk about breeding and pheno hunting, and this, when the fucking rubber meets the road and you have a bunk batch and you need to make something out of it and you can't cold cure it into a princess, these are the guys that you're going to need to call and talk to.
He just hit on the head exactly what I was trying to ask, or going to get after. I want to later on ask questions about pressure, and less heat. I use basically a lot of heat. I realize that I am doing some pressure involved with what I'm doing, but we'll get into that. But I work for a patient-based cooperative, so we're always looking for different SKUs or product offerings, and that's what I've kind of been asked to take a lead on. And when we were doing distillate carts, I started turning all into solventless, and we got a huge production on the rosin side. But what I put in there compared to what my boss wants me to put in there is 100% different. I'm like, fuck that, let's get some cash, lower the price and get you some freaking cash flow so I can get paid my hourly a little bit more. But no, I put the 45 and my 220 secondary presses, the 120 bags sometime on different stuff, my non-desirables for my rosin, and then cart that. Sounded like on a lot of stuff that Mikey was saying, I'm doing that to turn stuff that's not desirable into something that maybe a mode of access that somebody else would be exactly what he just described. I'm looking for that in product offerings, but I wanted to go into asking, what do you preferably suggest putting into these well-designed, newer hardwares for those types of carts? Obviously really appreciated the SKUs, the different types of offerings that normally would turn something that sits onto a shelf or may not be as desirable of the first intent. Type of a deal. Sorry.
I think it depends what kind of cart you want to bring to the market, right? If fire's always going to be fire. So don't try and put a shitty material and sell a fire cart.
Everybody loves it. I'm dead serious. I give them the fucking all 45, and they're like, "That's the best fucking part of my life."
If that's the way it turns out, then you're doing something right. Yeah, for sure. I wouldn't like. I just saying if you're gonna put all shitty input into carts, you're gonna give carts a bad name all the time. Like we need to make carts out of good material as well, especially if you have a process that's gonna maintain the terpene profile of it. Then I'd like to see carts out that just give dabbers a different, more convenient experience, right? I don't want dabbers saying, "Oh, this is just another shitty cart."
Mikey?
Yeah, so I agree that you want very premium stuff in your carts, just like JarTech, that kind of gross taste that you're getting. I like to put premium spectrums in JarTech. I like to put premium spectrums in carts. I definitely don't like anything above like 160, 180. Sometimes you can get cleaner stuff in the 45 through 73. That might be fine. But yeah, I think it's the best possible thing that you can do is the least adulterated thing that you can do. Something that you're going to run across where I do think that there is value with the unwanted bags is where you are recollecting the terpenes and adding them back in and being able to remove some unwanteds there. The process or the problem I see with capturing terpenes and adding them back in is if you've gone to enough of the NECANs and whatevers and walked around to all the different people trying to sell you terpene mixes to be able to mix with distillate to put in a cart, you're never opening one of those and being like, yeah, that fucking smells like fire live rosin. Like it smells like a science experiment someone tried to kind of make smell like that, but it's missing thiols and a whole bunch of other things that aren't contained within a terpene solution that really adds the full flavor there. So I think that if you want to clean something up and make it a more viable, lower cost product that's not a BHO product, there's definitely those type of things. If for some sort of magical reason that we don't understand, your 45 through 73 and your 160 through 220 makes these amazing carts that all your patients love, well then fucking rock it, man. Right. So I always just make sure that when I'm doing something like that, that I try to really budget it as that. Something that I don't like is that we just take all of our budget rosin and that we throw that at edibles or other things. And there's lots of budget smokers out there. Fuck, I'm one of them sometimes. You know what I mean? So like, although I might not be able to smoke the first 3 washes in the 70 through 160, like I might be able to smoke something that's kind of as good and has that same flavor profile, and I have to hit a little bit lighter on the nail, but I'd still much rather that than having to go to some overly CRC'd BHO to be able to smoke. So yeah, I think that there's value in those things.
We got time for like 2 more questions. I got one right here. High Tide. Headspace in your jars. Good question.
Yeah, I don't like over 2/3. And since we're talking about that, I want to talk about two things real quick. So with JarTech, like I was saying, I'm not a huge fan of the recapturing of terpenes, although I think there is definitely some cool science. And I think as we get further along into understanding everything that's happening, the work that people are doing with a much more expensive equipment is going to become much more prevalent and much more industry forward, regardless of if I think that's a good effect or not. So I think we should all be looking into that. There's two things with JarTech. One is that we run into the issue of being able to hold more pressure, but we're doing it in these like ball jars and U-line jars. I talked to the guy from the little thermal things that were alchemy jars. He was supposed to specially design us a lid. I haven't gotten anything from him yet. So you're looking into containers that you can pressurize. Sometimes it's talk about pressurizing them with an inert gas. So Summit SPD has a all clear, it's probably Pyrex or quartz or something like that, can be pressurized. The problem with adding pressure to a diamond miner is that they might have a sight window, but you're doing this all on visual by bubbles as far as my type of process with keeping the pressure in there. So check out Summit's equipment. They do have a vessel that's completely clear that you can see into to pressurize. And the other one was, last time I brought up a concept, and I'd like to see if anyone worked with this. So you can do JarTech without heating it to 220 or whatever, 240 degrees. You can keep it under 100 degrees. How I was taught this was you're doing very small presses and you're filtering them through natural coffee filter paper. You're then collecting all of those, putting them into a jar and heating that 90 degrees. And this is how you make Percy sauce. Really, right? I don't know if they changed their production yet, but the person that taught me this worked in their lab for 2 years pressing out in Oakland, and that's how the Percy sauce is made. It's never taken over 90 degrees, and that's how they're able to maintain such a better terpene profile, but still get that really BHOE look. Now, there's a paper called ChemTech, right? It would be very similar to the coffee filter paper. I'm thinking that we can do larger presses and do the Percy Tech with ChemTech paper. I just haven't experimented myself with that. Has anyone done any pressing with ChemTech paper?
Question back at the audience.
No? Okay, cool. Next
Is it
time I'd
just
like to hear
ChemTech?
some yeses on both of those.
Is this just Chemtech, or do you wrap it with like a nylon mesh and then the Chemtech?
So awesome addition to that. So they were literally pressing these on hair straighteners. There was a specific brand of hair straightener that they would use and a specific brand of coffee filter paper. I'm not shitting you. It's 10 to 12 gram bricks. You heat the hair dryer up to 180 degrees, press it for 30 seconds, remove your puck, put in a new piece of parchment, press it again for 30 seconds. You turn it off before you start pressing it for this one, and that's your Percy sauce. You put that into a jar. I would take that stuff when I was done, and I'd throw all those little pucks into a 25 and repress them. I think that you could make a bigger puck to basically like slightly smaller than a 3x6, wrap it with ChemTech, wrap that in a bag, be able to do this process in a much more production-friendly manner. I'd love to see some of you experiment with that.
I have a question.
Shoot.
I have a question to the audience here. How many people started making rosin on a hair straightener back in the day? Yeah, I thought so. Shout out to the hair straightener rosin.
Shout out to all the upset girlfriends.
There's many. I owe my wife about $1,000.
All right, so we got 15 minutes left. What do you guys want to talk about?
I also did want to mention, at least for the THCA extraction, that my main goal with the temperature, I never go higher than the original temp that I used to press the hash at. So if I press that 180, I don't ever really go back up past that unless it's the super final cleanup stage, which is pretty much wrapping the bag with the THCA still inside of it with unbleached coffee filters. And that will, you be using the coffee filter as a wicking agent to pull the remaining bit of terpenes that are caught in the nylon mesh away from it to then make your THCA super bright and white. But on that last step is usually when I'll hit that 180, 190 mark max. But I never go above, try to never go above the temperature I press the rosin at.
We got a question right here. Question was referring to a state.
So that was spinning stuff out in a centrifuge. If you go really, really hard, the understanding is that you can get a fats and waxes layer at the bottom. That's going to negatively affect what you're putting into carts. So that's at a solution that has been decarbed to the point where it's no longer going to renucleate. So that's applicable to carts. I guess you could put sap in a jar and it could be something there. And, you know, there's all sorts of Tony V type stuff with whatever, trying to do those things. And yeah, we've talked about it, but that's one way that I definitively know. But you have to have a solution that's movable enough. I do not, but I can tell you what he might be able to tell you. Also, Harry from Helpful Harry or Rosette. Harry knows a decent amount about that stuff.
Yeah, I think my understanding is you want to use a refrigerated centrifuge and get up to like 20,000 RPM, which generates a lot of heat. That's why you need the refrigeration on the centrifuge. So 20,000, I think, is the key there.
I trust what Lynn. I trust what Lindsay says, so I'd write that one down. We got one last question from Jonah in the back. Say that one more time for us, Lindsay. Run through what you were talking about.
I haven't, so I've just talked this tech with a friend of mine in the States who does it. I've never done it, but the numbers he told me was get a refrigerated centrifuge and 20,000 RPM minimum. Yeah.
We got one more question over here. True. Awesome. Well, guys, give it up for this panel, man. This was amazing. Incredible. We're going to have this all recorded and free for everybody to see on YouTube within a month or two. So we appreciate everybody coming up. We appreciate everybody coming on. So coming up, we have the live tasting grid with Mission Hill Melts, utilizing their tasting grid that we all gave you in your bags.